While working on CSS Grid tutorials, I've been asked quite a few times, how do I figure out the exact number of rows and columns needed for complex layouts, especially asymmetrical ones? In this video, I'll try to address that question by demonstrating how to create an asymmetrical photo collage using CSS Grid. We will take a strategic approach to grid definition, making it easier to position elements accurately, even in complex structures. So if you've ever struggled with defining grid layouts, this video is for you. But first thing first, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell if you haven't already. This is Optimistic Web, where we explore the world of CSS and front-end development, one step at a time. Let's first walk through the HTML we are working with today. We have a section element acting as the container for the photo collage. Then there is a series of div elements, each containing an image. If we look at the final product, there are 4 decorative items, 1, 2, 3, and 4, that don't have any associated images. We will use empty divs as placeholders for these decorative items. The ARIA hidden attribute is applied to ensure that empty elements don't interfere with accessibility. It will remove decorative items from the accessibility tree, enhancing the experience for users of assistive technology. Now let's move on to the CSS. I've already set up some foundational styles for the page, mainly focusing on typography and a subtle background for the body. Since we are using CSS Grid to create the collage, the first step is to transform the parent element into a grid container. Now the challenge is how to determine the number of rows and columns needed for the design. In most cases, the layouts are simple enough to easily define the grid structure. Additionally, using the autofill and autofit keywords along with the repeat function makes it straightforward to generate as many columns or rows as needed. The grid auto columns and grid auto rows properties take this further by allowing us to configure automatically generated grid tracks. However, when the design becomes more complex, finding an optimal number of grid tracks can be tricky. Like in this case, the photo collage is so disorganized that finding a starting point might be challenging, especially for beginners. In my opinion, the easiest way to approach this is to start with the smallest unit of the grid. If we look at this design, there are multiple images we can use as starting points. For instance, taking the smaller image from the first row reveals the formation of a vertical track. Similarly, the next 3 columns become clearly defined. On the left side of the design, there is also a small image forming the first column, followed by another small image in the second column. And then, the remaining section can be divided into 2 more columns. Altogether, this design will require 8 equally divided columns. The only thing that we need to remember is that the starting element should be the smallest unit of the grid, ensuring that all grid items fit perfectly within 1 or more grid cells. Using this same concept, we can determine the number of row grid tracks. In this example, we will need 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 rows. The grid template rows and grid template columns properties, combined with the repeat function, will help us define the structure. Since our images have different aspect ratios, we can create a uniform appearance using the aspect ratio and object fit CSS properties. The parent element will add the border radius and ensure that the image doesn't overflow. Now comes the interesting part of placing grid items into their respective cells. By default, CSS Grid uses an auto-placement algorithm to arrange items within the container. However, we can choose to manually place all or specific grid items based on the design requirements. As we have learned in previous videos, there are several ways to selectively place grid items. We can use grid line numbers, grid line names, or explicitly define grid areas to arrange items. For this type of layout, working with grid areas will likely be the most straightforward approach. So let's start by assigning a unique name to each grid item. We will use the nth child pseudo-class to target different elements. The first child will be named 1, the second one will be called 2, and the rest of the elements will follow the pattern. Once that's set, we can use the grid template areas to lay out the map. Each string in grid template areas defines 1 row of the grid, and each word or space in the string represents a column within that row. Multiple adjacent cells with the same name create a single grid area. For example, in this layout, the cells marked as 2 form a single grid area that spans 3 columns and 3 rows. Similarly, the grid area 11 covers 2 columns and 2 rows. To indicate an empty area in a grid, one or more full-stop characters can be used, like I'm using 2 dots to represent an empty cell. The layout is almost ready, but we still need to add the decorative elements. So let's add a background and a one-sided border radius to create the shape for the 4th grid item. Then, a similar styling will be applied to the 6th, 8th, and 9th items. Finally, we will add a hover effect for the images. This will scale the image up slightly with a rotation of 3 degrees, and the transition will smooth out the animation. And that's how we can create a fully responsive photo collage using CSS Grid. At first, it might seem challenging to define the grid structure, but as we discussed, starting with the smallest unit of the grid makes it much easier to tackle. If you haven't yet, check out my detailed videos on working with CSS Grid to help you conquer layout challenges. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Feel free to leave your questions or comments below. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.